Its wings were longer than those of a Boeing 747, and even the Antonov 225, it cost a literal fortune to build, but it only flew once for less than 30 seconds. So what was the Spruce Goose and why was it made in the first place? Today I will tell you a story about a true aviation icon, which started off as an incredibly ambitious wartime project driven by one man's passion and got to fly only because that passion turned into an obsession. Stay tuned. It's really difficult to get a sense of the size of this aircraft by just looking at a picture of it, but you can start to get a feeling for it if you look closer at those 8 engines on its wings. They don't look very big, do they? But these are Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Majors. They each have 28 cylinders arranged in 4 rows and are the biggest radial engines ever made. As you can see, they look much bigger on a Boeing 377 or a Convair B-36. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. To understand the Spruce Goose or the Hughes H-4 Hercules, which is its proper name, we need to dig deeper into what aviation looked like before the start of the Second World War, and more specifically, we need to look at flying boats. These are aircraft with sea hulls, who, as the name suggests, were built to operate from the sea or other bodies of water instead of from airports. Now, have you ever wondered why we pilots wear the uniforms that we have, or why passengers generally board the aircraft from the left-hand side? Well, both of these details have a naval connection. The boarding is done from the left because large ships were already boarding passengers from their left or their port side. There were a lot of direct links between passenger ships and passenger aircraft in those early days of aviation, and for good reason. In the 1930s, Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am, started using its Clipper flying boats for its multi-leg long-haul trips that span the world. And these flying boats used the same ports and piers as passenger ships did, so Pan Am decided to dress its pilots in more or less the same uniforms as ship crews used. Until then, pilots were usually wearing leather jackets and silk scarves instead, which made sense because many of those early aircraft had open cockpits, where it could be a bit drafty, to say the least. Back then, airfields were still rare or non-existent in many parts of the world, so by relying on normal seafaring ports, Pan Am and other early airlines didn't need to worry about finding suitable airports or other special infrastructure for those long trips. Now, all of this would eventually change, but the point that I want to make here is that when World War II broke out, many flying boats were still in service with various airlines around the world. And the fact that flying boats didn't need anything more substantial than a decent pier instead of an airport was also a handy advantage for many military planners, which brings us to something called the Battle of the Atlantic. For much of the Second World War, Britain and the Soviet Union relied on supplies that arrived primarily from the United States and Canada on commercial shipping. And at the same time, German and Italian U-boats were trying to sink as many of those ships as they could to disrupt the Allied war effort. This battle lasted more or less for the entirety of World War II, and it was constantly evolving. Commercial ships initially crossed the Atlantic alone, then in convoys, but German strategists believed that they could sink more ships faster than the Allies could actually build new ones. Now, this battle is too complicated for me to analyze in detail here, but the point is that the Germans were constantly getting better and better at it. After the war, Winston Churchill wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." So how do you solve this problem? How do you ship goods and people over an ocean infested with hostile submarines? Well, a number of different strategies were tried, but by 1942 the situation had gotten so bad that someone thought, how about using flying boats? Now, at the start of the war, many airliners, including flying boats, had already been repurposed for military use, but even the largest of these aircraft, like the Boeing 314 Clipper, weren't really big enough to make an impact as a cargo aircraft. Something much bigger would therefore be needed. Something that could carry at least 2 Sherman tanks, each weighing around 30 tons or around 700 soldiers. But the other problem was that this aircraft couldn't compete for resources with other military aircraft like fighters and bombers. And that meant that this new transport aircraft would not only need to be huge and have a boat hull, it would also have to be made using a non-war critical material, like wood. Of course, back then, aircraft with wooden structures weren't unheard of, and they even included military examples like the de Havilland Mosquito, but making a large freighter almost completely out of wood will be a huge challenge to do. The person who initially came up with this idea for a large freighter plane was a shipbuilder called Henry J. Kaiser. His shipyards were one of the many places building Liberty ships, which I'll get back to shortly. Kaiser referred to his flying boat freighter idea as the flying cargo ship, but he knew nothing about building aircraft, so he turned to another wealthy businessman, Howard Hughes. And this is where the Spruce Goose really starts to take shape. But why was only one ever built, and how did it actually come to survive to this day? Which it actually did. Well, right from the start, this project was hit by a lot of uncertainty and frustration. Just like you might feel right now when you're trying to keep up with the current news cycle. Every day, we are constantly being bombarded with news from around the world, and it's super hard to track of what's accurate, what's being spun a certain way, and who is saying what. That's why I rely on ground news to cut through the noise and keep me informed with clarity and confidence. And that's also why I continue to work with them as sponsors for these videos. Ground News is a fantastic app and website where you can check stories from thousands of publications worldwide covering everything, including aviation. Let's look at this story, for example, about the recent IT breakdown that affected industries all over the world, especially airlines. And if you want to follow along, then visit ground.news/mentor. As you can see, Ground News digs deep into the facts without any added spin at all. In this case, they have gathered over 30 different articles published on this story, giving you a clear picture of what actually happened, and you can then gain access to those individual sources directly from Ground News. Just simply comparing headline coverage is actually quite interesting. Local sources here emphasize the outages affecting local airports, while few reference the global impact. This is just one example of how, depending on the sources of your information, you could have a slightly different perspective on the events. I am personally following the American presidential election very closely, so I appreciate that Ground News gathers all sides of the story and even shows what the media isn't covering. To try out Ground News yourself and become more aware of what's going on around you, use my link below here, which is ground.news/mentor, for an awesome 40% discount for unlimited access. Supporting my sponsors directly supports me, so I encourage you to check it out. Thank you, Ground News. Now, where was I? Yes. Howard Hughes was quite a complicated and busy man, to put it very mildly. Depending on who you were at the time, you would have heard of him as a Hollywood film producer, an airline owner, a businessman, an aircraft manufacturing executive, or even as a pilot. Hughes' wealth came primarily from the Hughes Tool Company, which his father had founded, making equipment and holding key patents for tooling for the oil industry. But back in 1939, Hughes also got into the airline industry by getting control of Transcontinental and Western Airlines, probably better known as TWA. In that role, Hughes was instrumental in the development and funding for Lockheed's Constellation, which I've already talked about in a previous video actually. But even before that though, Hughes had already founded the Hughes Aircraft Company, designing a number of aircraft for civil and military use, none of which actually ultimately went into production. Even so, the Hughes Aircraft Company was very busy during the war, making components for aircraft and other wartime equipment as a subcontractor, while still continuing to pursue their own aircraft designs. So that was the situation when Henry Kaiser approached Howard Hughes in 1942 to discuss his idea of a flying cargo ship that could overfly the U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic rather than sail through them. And Hughes immediately jumped on the idea. By this time, the Hughes Aircraft Company had been exploring the use of wood laminates in aircraft construction, making them super thin, very light, but still quite strong. This process was called Duramold, and it would turn out to be a mixed blessing, but I'll get back to that. Originally, the aircraft was going to be named the HK-1 for Hughes Kaiser 1 as the first joint project by the two men. 7 different design configurations were considered, including one with a twin boom fuselage that Hughes had used in other previous concepts, but the configuration that was eventually chosen turned out to be a little bit more conventional. The Spruce Goose was a high wing design, like most flying boats at the time, with a cantilever wing and the entire structure made out of Duramold wood laminate, except for some control surfaces that were fabric-covered aluminium. The plane was 66.6 meters or 218 feet long, and its wingspan measured 97.5 meters or 320 feet. In other words, its wingspan was about the same as the length of a modern football field, meaning that the only aircraft with a bigger wingspan in the history is another one-off design, the scaled composite 351 Stratolaunch Rock, which flew for the first time in 2019. But building the Spruce Goose wasn't easy. Delays in the program eventually caused the partnership between Henry Kaiser and Howard Hughes to break up completely. Like I said earlier, at the time this was going on, Kaiser was building Liberty ships, and to understand why he left this project, you have to know a little bit more about those ships. Because of the staggering U-boat losses, Liberty ships were designed for quick manufacturing. Over 2,700 of them were eventually built, and crucially, by 1943, building one took an average of just 39 days, from laying the keel to the finished ship sailing away under its own steam. Contrasting that incredible pace with the way that Howard Hughes went about designing and building the HK-1 was, well, a bit awkward, I guess. The initial contract that Hughes and Kaiser had was for 3 HK-1s, and all 3 should have been delivered 2 years after the contract was signed on the 16th of November 1942. But that just wasn't going to happen. Just a year and 4 months after the contract was signed, Henry Kaiser left the partnership. Hughes decided to continue the project alone, and the aircraft was therefore renamed from HK-1 to H-4 Hercules. Hughes also renegotiated the contract for the project, limiting it to just 1 aircraft, basically as a development study. Now, most references suggest that Kaiser left the project because he was getting increasingly frustrated with Hughes, whose obsession with every single detail of the aircraft was slowing things down dramatically. But was this actually true? There is plenty of evidence that Howard Hughes had OCD, which was a key part of his eccentricity, and to be fair, we are talking about what would become the biggest aircraft ever made, being developed by a relatively small manufacturer. So knowing that, delays wouldn't have been surprising, even without a perfectionist calling the shots, but Kaiser may have had much more pragmatic reasons for abandoning this dream of a flying cargo ship. You see, Kaiser took that decision around March 1944, and that date is important because by then the Battle of the Atlantic, which was the whole point of developing the flying cargo ship in the first place, had changed dramatically. Already by the second half of 1943, developments in code breaking, radar, radio direction finding equipment and anti-submarine weaponry meant that German U-boats weren't nearly as effective against ship convoys as they had been in 1942 and even in early 1943. At the same time, the production of merchant shipping and other wartime goods for the Allies was only getting faster. Attacks on convoys didn't go completely away until the end of the war, but at this time it was clear that the tide was now turning. So by 1944, the case for a really big cargo aircraft that could fly over the ocean just wasn't as compelling as it had been just a year and a half earlier, especially since that development program now faced more and more daunting delays. And yet, Howard Hughes didn't give up on the project, nor did he rush to get it finished. Soon the war ended, and many military contracts for other aircraft were cancelled, but Hughes kept up this work on a project which certainly looked impressive, but just made less and less sense as the time went by. Even if we ignore the fact that the U-boat threat had been almost solved in more conventional ways, the design of the Spruce Goose also had other problems. Like I said earlier, its laminate wood construction meant that it didn't need valuable aluminium, but it still needed 8 very valuable radial engines, which came with their own development problems and delays. That laminate wood construction also proved harder than expected to productionize, especially for an aircraft this big. But perhaps the most serious problem with the material was that after the war, when there was no more scarcity for aluminium and when pressurized aircraft became the future, the technology around laminate wood production just wasn't especially useful. Boeing and Douglas, who had built large bombers and transport planes during the war, were able to build on this experience to develop jetliners and other civil and military aircraft in the 1950s and 60s. Hughes couldn't really do the same with their expertise in laminate wood manufacturing, but what about the fact that the Spruce Goose was a flying boat design? Could the ability to operate away from airfields still give such an aircraft a useful role? Well, the easy answer to that one is no. While there still are some flying boats operating today, for example in firefighting or maritime patrol roles, large passenger and cargo flying boats didn't have much luck after the war. The reality was that World War II showed everyone how valuable aircraft would be in the future, and that quickly led to the creation of airports basically everywhere, not to mention the runways that had already been created during the war. So with that valuable infrastructure now coming into place, why would airlines continue to use flying boats, especially when you consider the limitations of operating aircraft this way, like the need to look out for corrosion from salt water, rough seas, or the extreme compromise in aerodynamics that came from using a hull. To be fair, Howard Hughes didn't necessarily know how aviation would evolve in the future, although, as I said earlier, already back in 1939 he did have a big hand in the development of the Lockheed Constellation, which would have a pretty healthy career as a land-based airliner after the war. As for the Spruce Goose, after even more delays, it was finally finished in 1947 and was then taken to Long Beach, California and reassembled to start making low-speed and high-speed taxi tests. Legend has it that when Howard Hughes himself set at the controls of the Spruce Goose in November of that year for yet another set of taxi trials, many of the people on board had no idea that he intended to actually take the aircraft into the air. Today, flight testing of a brand new aircraft type is only allowed with a specially trained crew, plenty of detailed briefings about every aspect of that testing, and of course nobody is allowed on board unless they are necessary for the test. But that's not how things were done back then. The Spruce Goose's first flight included 2 pilots, one of whom was Hughes of course, 2 flight engineers, 18 other crew members and 14 press people and industry representatives. Quite a crowd, but it was a big aircraft, I guess. Hughes took the plane into the air for less than half a minute, climbing no higher than 70 feet over the water, or just 25 feet according to other sources, and the aircraft then covered about half a mile before touching down again. Sadly, this would be the only flight that this impressive aircraft would ever perform. Now, there were some other controversies here as well, specifically about this flight and the real reasons behind it. You see, when Hughes did this, he was under huge pressure for his company's use of government funds to finish an aircraft that didn't seem to have any meaningful purpose anymore. And the theory was that by flying the aircraft, Hughes would prove that it was airworthy and not get in trouble for using these funds.
I've put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
The aircraft had cost $23 million to build in the 1940s, which today would be around $280 million. But to be honest, I don't think Hughes made this flight just for the money. The flight itself didn't really prove any of the aircraft's promised characteristics for speed, load capacity, range or cruise altitude, since at only 25 or even 70 feet over the water, it was well within the ground effect conditions for its entire flight. And Hughes didn't just use this monster of an aircraft as a way to get government funding. We know that because even after this flight, he kept a large maintenance crew on hand to keep the Spruce Goose in good working order until his death 3 decades later in 1976. It goes without saying that any thoughts that a wooden flying boat of that size could have some practical role was completely partial by the 1970s. But all this time, the aircraft was kept in a football pitch-sized climate-controlled hangar, which was in itself amazing, and that alone showed what kind of obsession this aircraft at that point had become for Hughes. The Spruce Goose remained there in pristine condition, but away from the public until about 1980. It then changed hands a couple of times, and today you can still admire it if you travel to the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in Oregon. And by the way that aircraft was then broken down, carried to Oregon and then rebuilt in that museum is actually a fantastic story in itself. Even after the Stratolaunch Rock's flight, the Spruce Goose remains the largest wooden aircraft, the largest seaplane and the largest propeller-driven aircraft ever built. Howard Hughes remained eccentric and controversial until the end of his life, as has been shown in many movies and books by now, and the Hughes Aircraft Company continued to make equipment for the aircraft and spacecraft for many decades until it eventually became part of Raytheon. By the way, Howard Hughes hated the name Spruce Goose, which to be fair wasn't just unflattering, it was also inaccurate. You see, the wood used in the plane's construction was primarily birch, not spruce, so Hughes preferred to call it the Hercules instead. Still, Spruce Goose has stuck to this day. That's even what the Evergreen Aviation Museum calls it on their website. The plane has also been called the Flying Lumberyard or some other less politically correct names. Now it is perhaps fitting that the only aircraft ever made with an even bigger wingspan than the Spruce Goose is also a one-off and the brainchild of another aviation visionary, the Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. But fortunately the Stratolaunch Rock has flown more than once and looks set to be used as a test bed for launching hypersonic vehicles, and if you guys know someone out there who can give me a ride on that thing, just send me an email. There are more stories around the Spruce Goose that are also worth exploring, like the fact that many of the workers that built and developed the wood composite technologies for it were women, and who also kept maintaining it and had a key role in maintaining it for the decades that followed. But what do you think about the Spruce Goose? Have you had a chance to see it in real life? Let me know in the comments below. This video forms part of my classic series, which includes many other aviation icons from the last century. I hope you have liked it and that I've earned a like and subscribe from you. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.